Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know, from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars, topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Basketball Podcast, right here in the GSMC Podcast Network. It is your host back again with news, updates, everything happening in the world of basketball, Brice Lewis. And you know what we're going to talk about today, the big trade that happened in the NBA on Wednesday. Yes, sir. James Harden finally got his wish and was traded from the Houston Rockets. He is now a member of the Brooklyn Nets. We're going to break down the entire trade, my thoughts on the trade, everything involved right here to start off the show. We're also going to talk about the Kyrie Irving situation continued. Obviously, everybody wondering now that Harden's a part of the team, how will chemistry work? When will Kyrie even come back? Will Kyrie potentially ever come back? We'll discuss that. Talk about some news and rumors happening around the NBA and other spots. Also talk about what the Rockets owner was thinking about trading James Harden to the 76ers. Ben Simmons being happy he wasn't traded, all of that. So we got a lot to talk about. Basically just a huge fallout from the James Harden trade. So, that's what we're going to do today on the podcast. But before we get into that, I'd just like to remind you guys, if you want to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball, we definitely appreciate it. Keep up with us for highlights, updates, reviews, everything that happens in the NBA world of basketball. We try to keep up with GSMC, and we love also to use that to hear from you and your opinion and your thoughts on things that are happening in the world of basketball as well. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, obviously, like I said, the James Harden trade has happened. It was a big trade, and now we're going to get over the details. I'm going to tell you all the details of this trade before I start breaking it down. So first, in the Nets side of things, the Nets, all they got was James Harden, the superstar, one of the greatest offensive players to ever play in this generation, James Harden. That's all they wanted. KD wanted to play with him. Now they have him. Now the Rockets, they're the ones who obviously wanted a big haul back. Now I've been saying for the longest time, to make this deal happen, you can't just have a 2-team. It has to be either 3, and with this trade, it was 4 teams that it took to get the job done. The Rockets got Victor Oladipo, which I think is an underrated pickup. Dante Exum, who's currently injured but will come back in about a month or so. Kirkus, I might say his name wrong, but, also from the Pacers. They got him in a trade. They got 3 Brooklyn first-rounders, 1 Milwaukee first-rounder, and then 4 Brooklyn first-round swaps. So they basically got all the capital that they were trying to get back for the trades for Chris Paul and Russell Westbrook in this trade, plus some players also as well. Now, the Pacers, who were also included in this deal, gets Caris LeVert and a second-round pick. Now, some people were shocked by this. People thought Caris LeVert was headed to the Rockets. He's that young star. But instead, the Rockets decided to just take Oladipo off the Pacers' hands, who they've been looking to move for a while. We've been hearing rumors since the offseason of Oladipo wanting to leave Indiana, and they were able to find an agreement there. And then the Cavaliers, also getting involved, got Jared Allen and Taurean Prince. So they were able to pick up a couple of guys, too. And now Cleveland is the home of the big man because it feels like all they have is big men. And so those are all the details of the trade. So if we break this trade down, overall, we know what Brooklyn wanted. I think we've been hearing rumors that James Harden and Kevin Durant have been talking for a while about playing together once again. So clearly when in today's NBA especially, when players say, hey, I kind of want to play with you, we should try to play together, usually you don't take that with a grain of salt. You really, truly believe that, hey, that may be something they may try to push for. I think when James Harden came into this next season, he saw the team. He saw, everything happening. He was just like, I don't know if this is going to work. And I'm sure Katie was just like, hey, I'd like to play with you again. You come to Brooklyn, we'll compete for a championship. And James probably saw that and said, you know what, that's probably the best opportunity I have right now. And so that's why, when he saw they traded Russell Westbrook and the fact that, management was going in a different direction. I think James said to himself, it's time for me to maybe pack my bags and go. Now, we could talk about how James carried himself during this process. Obviously, we think the ending point, the breaking point was the press conference after they lost to the Lakers, getting blown out by the Lakers on Tuesday. Him talking on the press conference saying that it's just there's no way you can fix this situation. I love Houston, but it's just not going to work here. And that was, and honestly, that was the first time James Harden has ever been public about any type of displeasure or disdain, not disdain, but just his desire to leave the franchise. And so that's why a lot of people were just like, oh, he finally publicly said it. And then incorporating that with all the reports we've heard of him getting in arguments with teammates, issues with teammates, being out of shape, overweight. Now you're hearing, after James Harden was traded, or at least the day he was said to stay away from practice, DeMarcus Cousins said the disrespect started way before the interview. John Wall, after the game on Tuesday, said, listen, after 9 games, man, you just already trying to quit on the team. It's hard to do anything if you ain't going to buy in. And, basically, you could clearly tell his teammates were fed up with it. And basically, James Harden made himself a very hard player to deal with there in Houston. Remember, before the season, Houston said they were willing to get uncomfortable. But seeing the lengths that James Harden went to, they probably were just like, yeah, we're at risk of our locker room being fractured and broken apart if we keep him here. And that's the last thing we want to do with a new head coach, a new GM, and a new direction. So they were able to finally get him out the door, and he's able to go play with his good friend, Kevin Durant, and now makes Brooklyn the automatic favorite coming out of the Eastern Conference. And now it's really in a lot of people's eyes, and my eyes as well. It's finals or bust. They have to get to the finals. If they don't get to the finals, this season is a failure. And so, because listen, the Lakers are a really good team too. So if they lost to the Lakers in the finals, we're not going to look at that as a failure. But if they don't make it to the finals, especially in this Eastern Conference that really doesn't have a strong team this year, outside of them really in terms of star power, I think that they should be able to be pretty successful in their goal in terms of making it to the finals. Now, if you're looking at what the Rockets got, I think Victor Oladipo is going to be a very interesting pickup. Now, I've heard some news, potentially Oladipo could be on the trading block again later with Houston. They said that Houston necessarily is not trying to sign Oladipo to a long-term deal. We don't know. Obviously, they're going to probably see how Oladipo and the John Wall backcourt works together. And then they also got a couple other players in the trade, to help add some depth to the roster. Dante Exum, he's a good player when he gets back. And, like I said, the biggest thing for Houston, what they truly wanted out of this trade was draft picks. They just needed to replenish their future that they had to give away dealing with James Harden. And they felt like this trade gave them that ability. So, they feel like overall they may have not gotten that young star player that they could build around for the future, which you would think 76ers could have gave them a Ben Simmons, but they did get the draft picks they wanted back, and I think that's why at the end of the day they were still satisfied with this trade. And then also with Caris LeVert going to Indiana, I think we have to talk about that because I think that's a good fit for Caris LeVert. Caris LeVert is probably one of the more gifted scorers we have in this league. He can clearly drop. We saw it in the bubble when literally everybody on Brooklyn didn't come to the bubble, and he was literally the only guy who came. And he had to basically be the best player on the team, and he showed out. And I think especially with that team that basically in Indiana with Miles Turner and Sabonis and Michael Brogdon and those guys, TJ Warren, I think him getting added to that mix works better. I think Oladipo was ready to leave. I think Oladipo was still trying to prove to people he was back from his injury. He's healthy. He's ready to go. And I think Caris LeVert is a guy who may fit better in that system in Indiana. Because Indiana, listen, they legitimately have perennially 5 potential all-star players. And I think Caris LeVert now going from the bench to being a starter, I think is going to really show how good he is with Indiana for us this year and really help that team out, partnering with Michael Brogdon in the backcourt. So I think that's going to be a really good deal. And like I said, I think a lot of people were surprised by the fact Houston didn't get Caris LeVert because people thought, oh, he's that young player, right? Oladipo's fine, but you wouldn't sit here and say that he would be the guy they'd want. And the fact that they basically, in a way, they basically traded Caris LeVert for Victor Oladipo. They basically said, listen, hey, Indiana, we'll take Oladipo off your hands. Because listen, Oladipo, like I said, is a guy they may not see being a part of the team in the future. He may just be there for the rest of the year. He may only be there till the next trade deadline. And with that being known, that gives them flexibility. With Caris LeVert, he's a younger guy, so you may feel like, do we really want to pay a lot of money to a guy like that? So I think that's going to be that's why they maybe make that decision. But overall, I think, I feel like this trade, solidified everything that needed to happen for the James Harden situation. And overall, when we look at the Nets, we'll see what happens when Kyrie gets back. Plus, I'm going to talk about Kyrie more in depth next segment. But I think the thing about the Nets is that clearly chemistry is going to be the big question with this team. Because you got Kyrie and James Harden who like to handle the ball, have high level of ball usage, in terms of an offense. Especially James. He's been used to having the ball in his hands all the time. And, the only player in this offense who really doesn't need the ball all the time is Kevin Durant. Because Kevin Durant is a guy who's a very efficient scorer. He can get 30 on 15 shots. He doesn't need 20, 22 shots to really, really take advantage and really beat Kevin Durant. And so he'll be fine to me. I think Kevin Durant's the one guy who will be fine in this situation. It's going to be between Kyrie and James Harden. Because you got to figure out, okay, who's handling the ball? Who do you prefer to handle the ball? And who's willing to be the third option and take a sacrifice and a hit to their statistics? Remember, Kyrie has only been a second option in his career. James has basically been the first option. The last time he was basically maybe third best scoring option was in Oklahoma City when he was young, when he wasn't James Harden yet. So that was a different James. And now you're talking about MVP runner-up so many years in a row, former MVP. And you're telling him, yeah, you may have to be third option. It doesn't seem like it. So it seems like Kyrie's going to be the third option when he comes back. And the question is Kyrie okay with that? Can Kyrie work with that? Is Kyrie okay with maybe only averaging 18, 17 points a game and maybe getting only between 12 and 15 shots a game while maybe Kevin and James take more shots? That's something we have to see with Kyrie because, Kyrie, if you look at this Nets team, has been the more vocal leader for this team, even though Kevin Durant it's his team. And, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Now, obviously, like I said, when I go more in depth on Kyrie in a few minutes here, we'll talk about his whole situation, how it's going to affect the team moving forward. But, we're speaking hypothetically, if he does play this season out and comes back to the Nets and stays with the Nets, that, they're going to have to figure that out. And Steve Nash has a very tough challenge ahead of him to figure that out. Luckily, they have a very offensive-minded staff, so I'm sure they're going to try some things, try to see what works. How can we get them in the best position to be great? How can we get the max out of everybody? Maybe, listen, people talk about the Nets may have lost some depth because of this. Listen, they still have some good players on the bench coming off the bench. They feel like they can play well for them. I always said this year, this is going to be a big year in terms of depth for every NBA team because with COVID, you're going to have to play your 14, 15, 13 man, maybe more than you've ever played in just a normal 82-game season without COVID. So, everybody has to really be able to play. You have to be confident in them being able to play. And, I think that this is going to test the Nets' depth. But as long as everybody stays healthy, Kyrie, James, and KD, I think the Nets are going to feel confident about their chances moving forward. They're going to feel confident about winning in the future. And I think they're going to feel confident overall just about, this team. And so, like I said, if everything works out for them, I expect the Nets to get out of the Eastern Conference this year. I think they are the best team on paper. Remember, Boston is young. We got to see what happens with Kemba Walker and his knee. Milwaukee hasn't looked as good as they've looked in previous years. Plus, we've seen how they've been in the playoffs. 76ers, they're probably the biggest wild card in this. Because in terms of top-end talent, you may be able to say they can compete a little bit more with the Brooklyn Nets and other teams. But we have to see how everything meshes together. Raptors, obviously, we see how they've fallen apart. They struggle offensively. Miami is just not as good as they were last year. So this really is, Brooklyn's conference to win and lose. So we'll have to see what happens. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into the Kyrie Irving situation, how his decisions that he's been making recently has affected the team. Will he be with the team? My thoughts, all that here and more on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we broke down the entire James Harden trade, my thoughts on the teams that were involved in this trade, everything that happened, the picks that were involved, Houston feeling like they got what they needed, which was the draft picks truly out of this trade. Now they've got their future back where they can use that. You never know. Houston could use that just to trade it again later just for ammunition to get certain players. You never know. So, and listen, with the teams involved, depending on where Cleveland ends up, or Houston, you never know. These could be very valuable picks for them in the future. So, Houston definitely tried to get what they needed to get out of this trade. And James Harden finally now can be somewhere where he wants to be. And hopefully we'll see the James Harden that we've seen the last, literally most of the 2010s ever since he was traded to Houston. So it'll be very, very interesting to see that dynamic in Brooklyn. But speaking of Brooklyn, we have to go back and talk about the Kyrie Irving situation. Kyrie still is not with the team. He still won't be with the team probably this week. He is also under investigation for going to a family function and not wearing a mask, so the NBA is investigating that. And there's just questions now about Kyrie Irving's status. Still, a lot of people within the organization are not really sure what's happening with Kyrie. What is he doing at this moment? Why can he not show up to work? All of that. So that's been a big thing for Kyrie Irving. And, this past week, Stephen A. Smith for ESPN on First Take made a very strong statement saying that he thinks Kyrie Irving should retire because he's clearly not committed to the game of basketball. And, something? I've been thinking that, and I mean this honestly, I've been thinking about that for about a year now, year and a half. Because I've always just looked at Kyrie and said to myself, he just seems like he doesn't, everything that comes with being a basketball player, he doesn't like. It actually bothers him a lot. And obviously we know the media has been his biggest enemy. But we know, but Kevin Durant has that issues with the media, but he's still not seem like, because of the media, I'm not going to do what I want to do. With Kyrie, it seems like it's actually affecting if he wants to even play the sport. And he's obviously, he made those comments before the season started about calling the media pawns. And, listen, it's funny. It's a joke that was made. Y'all remember that interview he had when he was in Cleveland, right? And they asked him about LeBron being a father figure, a parental figure. And they said ever since that interview, it's all went downhill from there with Kyrie and the media. Because he was just like, all right, so, yeah, I don't know if I like these guys anymore. But the point is, I just think overall, Kyrie's mind's just not in the game of basketball. The fact that you can sit here in the middle of a season and say, I'm not going to show up with the people that you play with for a guy that you consider your boy and Kevin Durant, and you're going to sit here and tell me you're not going to show up and there is no timetable for your return fully healthy. That to me, it makes me wonder if he is that invested in the game. It makes you wonder. Because listen, there's nothing wrong with him trying to, work with social injustice people, trying to, do what he has to do to, make a difference. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no wrong cause of that. He should definitely try to. But at the same time, he has to learn how to balance also playing and doing his job, which is playing basketball. Because you can do it. How come other players can do it, but you can't do it? Now, listen, he could take the Maya Moore route and, completely give up basketball and put all his time into it. But he hasn't said that yet. But literally, Chris Broussard on, I believe, The Herd, he said this. He said, I've heard things about Kyrie where he said, hey, some execs think he might retire. Like, literally, that word's being thrown around because the way Kyrie has been, it's not something you can rule out. Remember, last show I said, I think Kyrie might potentially not play again till the inauguration because there were reports that he didn't want to play because of what happened at the Capitol. And now it's like, you're in the middle of this season and you're just not going to show up for a couple. Because now it makes you wonder, what do you do it again? Would Kyrie just not show up again for 2 weeks? And the Nets, they always say the Nets only brought in Kyrie because that's who KD wanted. Because KD's their guy. KD is the face of that franchise. KD is the man. They are willing to do anything to make KD happy. So that's not, that's why they took on Kyrie. But now, especially with acquiring James Harden, especially if chemistry does not work, you legitimately could sit here and say the Nets can trade Kyrie. But the problem is who would want Kyrie? Because he is now proving to be a very huge headache, not just in Brooklyn, but also in Boston, also in Cleveland. This man was in a championship situation in Cleveland and said, I don't want to be in it anymore. I want my own team. So clearly in that situation, it makes you wonder what is Kyrie's, mindset with playing the game right now. Because literally, it was a report. Houston, when talking to Brooklyn, said, we don't want any part of Kyrie. Why would we want to trade a headache for a headache? And it makes sense because they're like, if Kyrie wasn't a headache, they'd probably be like, oh yeah, throw in Kyrie. But the fact that Kyrie was a headache, they were like, listen, we good on Kyrie. And that may be how a lot of teams feel. They may feel like, well, why would I go after a guy like a Kyrie Irving if he's going to bring that type of drama to our team? Really, it really makes you sit here and wonder. But at the same time, Kyrie is a very supremely talented basketball player, so it's not like if he's not on the floor, you're always going to be a better team, even though in Boston's situation, it looks like that's the case. Now, listen, if Brooklyn wanted to maybe look at this situation and say, hey, we don't want to trade Kyrie just because of the issues. If we can somehow look at the situation and see, okay, let's say he comes back and, James, KD, and Kyrie play together. And the Brooklyn Nets offense stalls a little bit. They struggle to have good chemistry. You could legitimately sit there and say Brooklyn and go to KD and say, hey, chemistry hasn't been good with Kyrie. And we just traded for James, so we're not getting rid of James. So are you open? Are you okay if we potentially shop Kyrie Irving? Because listen, there's even been reports that if the thing about Kyrie is he seems very particular about where he might want to play. And if he gets traded to the team that he doesn't want to play for, the way Kyrie has been, may legitimately sit here and say, I'm just not going to play for the rest of the year. Because that is legitimately what we now feel and see in Kyrie Irving now to this day. We believe he will do these things. And so now teams are like, we got to be a little careful with trying to get a guy like this. As they should. Because you don't know. You don't know what you're going to get from him. You don't know when things are going to change. You don't know when he's going to. So, listen. Overall, I think Brooklyn is committed to the situation. They're going to go into this and say, listen, we have three of the best players in the league. Talented players. We have a great opportunity to get out of the Eastern Conference this year with everything that I said in the first segment about every Eastern Conference team really having a big question. Where legitimately every team has a question with injuries and just, are they going to be good enough? Brooklyn, we know talent-wise they are good enough. Their question's going to be chemistry. And obviously, hopefully everybody stays healthy because obviously that's the issue for every team. Because if they can gel, if that can work, then the Nets, to me, will no doubtly be a top team, in the Eastern Conference if that happens. But if it doesn't work, what would be the issue? And again, like I've said, it will probably be that James-Kyrie dynamic, and that could cause some tough decisions to be made. Because, listen, if you're James Harden, you're probably not going to be able to average your 28, 29 a game. Unless KD's the one who surprised everybody and says, listen, I'll take 10 shots a game and average 20, 25 points. James, you can do what you got to do, and Kyrie, you can do what you got to do. And think about me, and the one good thing that you can legitimately say, at least in terms of the Kevin Durant, James Harden dynamic, you can talk about at least they have that friendship. Listen, we don't know how much of a relationship Kyrie and James really have. So that may be more of like a relationship that has to grow throughout. Where Kevin and James have already played together. They have a relationship with each other. And so it's going to be a little bit easier for them to adapt, to me. Especially since, like I said, KD can play more off ball. Like I said, but that working relationship with Kyrie and James is going to be the question. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see it, to me, not the coaching staff, but how KD handles it. Because I'm sure when players discuss these things, everybody has their own game. To me, I just don't sit here and think you can't sit here and never talk about how games mesh. You know what I'm saying? You can't sit here and say, well, I don't think our game can mesh. Because if you do that, then you're kind of just, to me, that's kind of like a lazy approach. Okay, Kyrie kind of likes handling the ball a lot. James likes handling the ball a lot. I want to play with James with Kyrie here. How would that work? I'm sure. Listen, here's the thing about Kyrie's situation as well. Even though, yes, I do believe Kyrie's not there, you don't think Kyrie has been communicating with Kevin? I'm sure him and Kevin have still been talking. So I'm sure they may have been discussing already, like, hey, so, we made that a trade for James. How are you feeling? This might change the way we play a little bit. How are you going to be with that? Like, I'm sure that's something they may be talking about. Unless, Kyrie really has gone MMA on the team. I'm sure that's going to be something they're going to talk about. Because, like I said, KD and Kyrie have a relationship. The great thing here for KD is he has a relationship with both of them. It's not like he's having to develop anything with them. He already has them. It's really those two that has to develop it. And since he's the friend of that mutual friend of both, he can help Steve Nash and that coaching staff really ingrain them into the team and say, okay, so this is how we have to play. And listen, it's going to be experimented first. There's going to be some times where stuff doesn't work. There's going to be times where things don't work. You just have to decide at the end of the day what is best. Like, think about it. One of the big questions with this team, who's going to take the final shot? Is it going to be KD? Is it going to be Kyrie? Is it going to be James? That's something they're going to have to figure out throughout the regular season. And that's the one good thing, obviously, about the regular season. With their talent, they should still be able to win plenty of games and make it playoffs. But they'll have some chances to experiment, try different things, try different lineups, see what works, see what system works. And then if you do that and you can go through and say, okay, this works what's best, they can try to get on the same page before the playoffs. And then by playoff time, they'll be ready to go. So, listen, it's all going to depend on Kyrie, how he comes back, where his mind is when he does come back, whenever he does come back. And that's going to be the big thing here, and is seeing if all three of them can end up meshing at the end of the day. So it's going to be very exciting to see how all of this turns out and plays out in Brooklyn. They're probably one of the most intriguing, if not the most intriguing team in the NBA now with this trade. And we're going to have to see how everything plays out throughout the season. Well, that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into some more fallout trade news from the James Harden trade, so stay tuned.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we talked about Kyrie Irving, more about his situation, how it's going to affect the Nets moving forward, what the expectation is for the Nets moving forward, how they can get the three to mesh, how KD could affect all of that. Because listen, this Brooklyn situation has now, I think from a storyline, like a season-long storyline perspective, this is probably the most interesting storyline that there is in all of the NBA. And so just to see with the chemistry of a team. So it's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on this situation and continue to further monitor what happens in Brooklyn, because people think they're going to be at each other's necks by April. I mean, we have people of all types of opinions about this subject with Kyrie and KD and James. So we're going to have to keep an eye out and see what happens in Brooklyn, because this could determine if they win a championship or not. But now we're going to get into some more news in the fallout of the trade. So there is another player who could be affected by this trade. And this is Washington Wizards shooting guard Bradley Beal. Obviously, he's considered in some people's eyes, maybe outside of Klay Thompson when healthy and James Harden, the second best pure shooting or third best pure shooting guard in the entire NBA. And so teams are hoping, after seeing what Jrue Holiday got, because he's a two combo guard but mainly a point, and then seeing what James got, you would probably put Bradley Beal, he's better than Jrue, but below James. So, but you've seen the packages that teams have gotten for those players. So teams are hoping that if they make a run for Bradley Beal, Washington won't ask for as much as much as Houston wanted for Bradley Beal. Because that's who they're really taking this off of, because people would probably say Bradley Beal is closer to a James Harden than Jrue Holiday, depending on who you are. Because clearly, think about it. Both draft trades involve huge draft hauls. You clearly see in the NBA, draft picks are thrown. When you are a championship team, draft picks are irrelevant to you. You truly look at draft picks as just like, this does nothing for me. If we have one, great. If the player ends up being a decent player, great. But honestly, I will throw this away for a star or a very good player quickly. You clearly see that. And so teams are going to be wondering and seeing, okay, what exactly, if Washington put Bradley Beal up and said, we'll accept trade, what would Washington want? Now, first, clearly, Washington is a team that is currently still rebuilding even to this day. They're probably not, they've played better recently. They've won some games recently, so Washington could be trending up. But let's say they still finish, below the top 10 in the Eastern Conference. Bradley Beal has to go. Now, if you're Washington, do you take the route of, okay, let's get a huge draft haul? Because the thing is, in both situations, you could say Washington doesn't necessarily need a huge draft haul. They're going to be a lottery team. They're going to get top picks anyway. But they may sit here and say, okay, maybe we can facilitate a trade. Because think about this. They only had to give up a first-round pick for Russell Westbrook when they traded John Wall. So they only give it one pick. So if anything, they could trade and just get that pick back. Clearly for Bradley Beal. You might get a couple extra picks. But the key also for Washington is, okay, are you going to want players back for Bradley Beal, or are you going to want more picks back? Remember, both Jrue Holiday and James Harden trades, the focus was primarily the picks. Houston got more players because obviously Jrue Holiday and James Harden are not the same kind of players, so you had to throw in even more than the draft picks for James. But Bradley's going to involve some players. But the thing is, Washington's probably not going to trade a star for a star. That's usually not going to be the case for Washington. They're probably going to have to trade Bradley Beal for maybe some good role players and some draft picks. So teams are just hoping They're not asking for a James Harden type of haul. Because you clearly saw no one team can just give everything that Houston wanted. They would have to get a third and a fourth team potentially involved to make that happen. And some teams are just hoping, is it possible we can maybe get Bradley Beal, give up a couple of our picks, maybe a couple of players, and Washington be happy with that? Because they're not going anywhere anyway, and maybe in some executives' eyes in the league. Why do I need to give up a boatload to them for Bradley Beal? Because Bradley Beal isn't James Harden. So, because remember, we don't really know, even though Bradley Beal's name has been brought up in trade talks for the last couple of years, we don't truly know what exactly Washington wants for Bradley Beal. Because they've never firmly dangled him out there and said, hey, y'all want him? So we don't truly know what they would want. But you would think they would probably say, well, if Drew Holiday could get that and James Harden can get that, we're wanting something in that ballpark for Bradley Beal. Because as a team, it's your due diligence, because the thing is that James Harden was an issue in Houston, and they still got that kind of haul. Drew Holiday wasn't an issue, but he's just been always mentioned in trade talks. So it's not like, oh, Washington's desperate to get rid of Bradley Beal, where they're just like, okay, we're going to take whatever we can for him. They're like, listen, we have no issue with keeping Bradley Beal here, so we may be willing to hold out for a little bit more of a bigger haul for him as well. Because they want to make sure they're keeping themselves up, especially since we've heard rumors about Washington potentially firing Scott Brooks because of the way the season started. If they fire Scott Brooks and this season goes down the drain, they may say, hey, we got to start over completely. We got to trade everybody. And so let's go ahead and get big hauls. Because remember, they also may have to trade a Russell Westbrook. Because Russell Westbrook, I think, may get traded again after this year. And if that's the case, they may sit here and say, okay, we got two guys we can get stuff back for. Russell, we're probably not going to get as much value back for as we could for Bradley. So let's try to maximize Bradley Beal's value. So it's going to be interesting to see that situation with Bradley Beal, because that clearly shows that teams must be expecting, depending again on how Washington's season ends up going, Bradley Beal may become available. And so they're just hoping, okay, if he becomes available, let's just hope they're not asking for that James Harden type of price. And speaking of Washington, before I get into my real next topic here, Russell Westbrook has suffered a major setback, and he will now be out for 2 to 3 weeks. Remember, he had that quad injury. He was supposed to be out for only a week. Now he'll be out for 2 to 3 weeks. Usually with injuries, this is always a fear. Usually if you tweak it, mess something up, re-injure it, that always can push it back. So Washington won't have Russell for a couple of weeks. So we're going to have to see how they are without him. They've actually played better slightly without Russell Westbrook, but we'll see how they continue to play moving forward. But now going into some other trade fallout news. So Fertitta, the Fertitta, the head man in Houston right now, clearly, when it came to the 76ers, the governor said he had no interest in reuniting James Harden and Daryl Morey together. He was adamant, according to Chris Haynes of Yahoo Sports, about not making a deal with Philly, especially with Daryl Morey being the former GM of the Houston Rockets. Because I remember when they were talking about that deal, that entire situation, what they were asking for from Philadelphia, they were like, we want Ben, we want Thibault, we also want Maxey. You clearly saw he was just like, listen, I do not want to give James to them. If they give us James, I want Ben, I want Maxey, I want Thibault, I want him. They basically say they would have to. You need to deplete your roster if you want James from us. You would have to deplete it. We need to take any good core piece you have, and if you really want James, because we don't want to trade him to you. Because you could sit here, you could realistically sit here and say, in terms of a player haul, they could have gotten a better player group of players. Houston could have got a better group of players from Philadelphia, and they would have had that young star. But they may have not gotten the draft picks potentially. Maybe they still could have. But they could have gotten a better group of players in this trade if they went with Philadelphia. But they decided to go with Brooklyn instead because Fertitta did not want to trade James Harden to Philadelphia. So that's why you've heard some people say, honestly, even though you heard Philadelphia in it, Philadelphia really wasn't that realistic of a destination for James Harden because Fertitta was just like, I don't want to give him to him. So it really was Brooklyn's to win. You know, it was really Brooklyn's to have. They really didn't have any competition because, listen, we heard the Heat were willing to get young players and some picks, but we all said their assets don't look the best. And Milwaukee said, well, James doesn't fit the culture. And Dallas said, oh, we're out. And it's just every other team that you even heard that potentially could have made that move was just not offering or presenting enough to Houston that would make them want to budge on a trade. And then you're seeing it now with Philadelphia. He was just like, no. But one person who is very happy about this is Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons is reportedly extremely ecstatic he was not traded, as they say he believes that Philly can win a championship. So clearly Ben Simmons is confident in this team. And I've noticed with the 76ers, the morale around the team has been much more positive since Doc Rivers has been there. They have put together a really good team. Now, obviously, they started the season 7-1. They've had the COVID issues, haven't been able to play games, haven't had a lot of players healthy. So they've lost games because they haven't had their guys. So when Philadelphia's been healthy and ready to go, they're 7-1. Ben Simmons has been dealing with a knee issue. They don't expect it to be long term, so they expect him to be back hopefully soon. But I can understand it. Ben probably says we're playing well this year. The flow's a little different. The coaching's a little different. I think that we have the talent. Because people have said this about Philadelphia for years. You got one of the most dominant players in Joel Embiid. Because Embiid's played excellent to start the season. You know, Ben Simmons has played well. And you have really good role players. Danny Green, Thibault, Maxi's been a really good player for them. So they really have had good contributions from a lot of guys on the team. And so I think Ben's looking at this team and saying, we may legitimately be one of the best teams. Like, legitimately, you could sit here and say Philly could be the second best team in the entire Eastern Conference behind Brooklyn. It could legitimately be Philadelphia and Doc Rivers versus Steve Nash and the Brooklyn Nets. And listen, of course we're going to go with the Nets, but the 76ers have the potential to really give them a challenge and potentially maybe make an upset because they have two high-end players. Now, clearly we'll have to see the development of Ben Simmons throughout the year and how everybody still meshes together. But it's something that I think helps with Ben. I think that's why another reason why Ben is happy about being here. Because, listen, we all knew coming in this year for the Philadelphia 76ers, seeing how the offense and how the team meshed together would very much dictate if Embiid or Ben would be traded. And remember, if you remember at this time last year, or you just remember last year in general, you heard when Philadelphia was struggling, Embiid was the guy who was going to be out. Now you're hearing, mainly with the James Harden train, Ben was the one who was going to be out because he can't shoot, and Daryl Morey is more of a I want guys who could shoot kind of guy. And so overall, it'll be interesting. But now with them not getting James Harden, I will say this. I don't expect Philadelphia to be quiet. I still expect them to make a move. Maybe not with Ben and Embiid, but I still expect them to try to get another player to help out. They have Tobias. I still feel like Daryl Morey, you know how he's a guy who will make magic. He'll make pieces move. I still expect them to, when the trade deadline, when they start hearing who's available, to try to make a move to help improve the team and maybe make that final push since they know Brooklyn's the top team now. How can we compete with them? So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Philadelphia 76ers going further into the season, and it's going to be very interesting to see how their season actually turns out. But that's all the time we have for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get some more NBA news and rumors right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment we discussed Fertitta, Mr. Fertitta, governor of the Houston Rockets, saying that basically he was adamant about not trading James Harden to the 76ers. He did not want to give him to Daryl Morey. He did not want to give them the ability to take the player that made the Houston Rockets who they were and now put it on 76ers and continue that success. So they reportedly basically said 76ers were really never in it unless they were willing to gut their roster for James. And that's why they were asking for so much from 76ers. And they could have gotten a better batch of players potentially from the 76ers, but they basically were just like, that's the one team we don't want to give him to. So that happened. And then also we discussed last segment about Bradley Beal and how teams hope that he'll be cheaper than Harden. Hopefully they won't demand a James Harden type of haul for Bradley Beal, as some teams are probably, depending on how Washington's season goes, is expecting Bradley Beal to be available. But now we're going to get into, trade rumors. And basically, it's not really rumors, but basically it's a CBS Sports article talking about players who could be traded now after the James Harden trade. And I'm going to discuss each player, my thoughts. Do I think they're going to stay? Do I think there's a high possibility they could leave? All of that. So we're going to go ahead right into it. So, first person on this list to discuss is Bradley Beal. So, we just talked about Bradley Beal. Bradley Beal has been in trade talks in terms of interest or people having interest in Bradley Beal for years. Again, the Wizards have started out 3-8. He's openly said they can't defend. He has these amazing games and they're not winning. They gave up Russell Westbrook, but it's just not helping. And the thing is, Bradley Beal, he's not as good as Harden, but like I said, he's a top 3 shooting guard in this game. Shooting guard has kind of became a position that hasn't been as, I guess, looked at as highly in previous years, but shooting guard is still a very important position, and Bradley Beal is one of the best. And so we just talked about teams are hoping the haul for him isn't as big and as great as it was for Harden. And Bradley Beal, I think there's plenty of... The thing about Bradley Beal that helps him is that he's a team player. He works hard. He's easy to deal with. And I think a lot of teams look at Bradley Beal and say, I would want him in my locker room. And I think that's why teams are sitting here saying, if Bradley Beal becomes available, we're definitely going to take a look. Like the Miami Heat, for example. The Miami Heat looked at James and said, they want us to give up a lot, and then he's kind of a headache. Where if we look at Bradley Beal, they may sit here and say, well, we can bring in a Bradley Beal. Bradley Beal comes off as a player who would fit the Heat culture and as a potential guy. And so we don't know, because Washington has been adamant about trying to play it out with Beal and stuff. But I think if you're Bradley Beal, the question is, you're still 26, you're still young, you're still in the prime of your career. You're coming off a career year. At a point, Bradley Beal is trying to be a good team player. He's not trying to, ruin team chemistry or anything like that. But we'll get to a point where he'll just sit here and say, listen, I have to move on. It's time for me to move on from Washington. And listen, there will be plenty of teams lining up. And that's the thing about Washington that I have to think about in the situation. They know there's going to be plenty of teams willing to go out of their way for Bradley Beal. So it's not like if you hang on to him, you're hanging on to him because it's going to be hard to get good value. You probably can get really good value for Bradley Beal. It just depends on the Wizards and if they're going to be willing to pull the trigger. And is Bradley ready to go and say, okay, send me somewhere else? That's kind of what we're waiting on. Do I think potentially he could be traded before the trade deadline? I think it's very possible. Bradley Beal is just hard. It's hard. I'll say this, if the Wizards continue on the path they're going down, I'll lean towards yes. He'll be definitely on the trade market and could potentially be traded. If the Wizards were able to pick it back up and start winning some games, maybe they're within the 10th spot. Obviously, since that means you can make the playoffs from that point in the NBA now, then no. But if they continue on the path they've been on, I would lean yes. Bradley Beal is someone I could see being traded. Next on the list, they have Kyle Lowry. Kyle Lowry is 34 in an expiring contract, but the Raptors are 2-8 this year. They have been absolutely abysmal offensively. They look like they're going through a down year this year. They lost, Marc Gasol and Serge. Siakam had to develop into what they thought he was going to get into after seeing those flashes, especially when the bubble hit last year. And like I said, with Kyle Lowry on an expiring deal, usually guys on expiring deals are very valued at the trade deadline for teams who just want to make that one push at this current season for a championship. And Kyle Lowry can help a lot of teams. I mentioned on a show 2 shows ago, I said, I think Kyle Lowry would be great for the Clippers. I think they need a point guard like Kyle Lowry. He fits that great defender, a leader, can facilitate the offense, handle the ball. He can make some big shots if he has to. And I think he'll be perfect for them. But I think any team who feels like we just need that veteran point guard to really help us take that next step would be interested in Kyle Lowry. I view Kyle Lowry as a guy who is more likely to be traded, especially it looks like the Raptors, if this is what they're going to be, I don't see the point of keeping a Kyle Lowry because you can't keep this team because he's going to be a free agent. And you know what every decision comes down to. Do we want to lose him for nothing or do we want to try to get something? So if the Raptors continue on this, on the route they're going, losing, not playing well, I definitely highly expect to see them maybe shopping Kyle Lowry. And so I would probably more likely say, hey, I think that this is a move that could be made. Also, outside of Clippers, Philadelphia is potentially a team that can make a move. They got Ben Simmons, but maybe they want another backup point guard, another veteran guard back there to help with playoff experience, with their run. So that's also a potential look they could get, they could look at as well. So Lowry is someone, I think he's a good guy, great leader, great team guy. He doesn't seem like the type who would demand a trade, but I'm sure he would be open to it, especially if he sees if this Toronto season continues to be as bad as it's been so far and things don't change. I definitely see him looking and saying, okay, I think it may be time for me to move on and, try to get with a championship team and try to make a run. And then we'll worry about free agency when we get to it. But Karl Anthony Towns is third on this list. And Karl Anthony Towns, he's an interesting pick. Right now he's injured. They were 2-0 with Karl Anthony Towns. They lost 7 straight when he got hurt. And listen, they've traded Wiggins, got Russell, drafted Anthony Edwards. Neither one of them have had great seasons. They've had decent seasons, but not great seasons. And so, usually with small market teams like Minnesota, like they're trying to do right now with Karl Anthony Towns, they're trying to convince him to stay with the Minnesota Timberwolves. He's their star. Karl Anthony Towns is a star big man. Can shoot the three, can handle the ball. He's actually an underrated passer. He can give you 20 a game. He's a really good player, a perennial all-star in today's NBA. And so he's a really good piece. And we really haven't heard his name a lot. But with Minnesota trying to still build around him and them still not finding that success, you would think after a while Karl Anthony Towns is going to get to a point where he's like, okay, we've been doing this for a while. I've given you some chances. We're not winning. I have to start considering what's best for me. Now, wouldn't the good thing for Minnesota is, like I said, this to me is probably the one player I think is least likely to be traded because he's still under contract for 3 seasons beyond this one. So he he's not in any danger of leaving free agency. So I think they're going to continue to try to build around him. But it's just a name that potentially could be out there. I don't see Karl-Anthony Towns as someone who would try to force his way out. He doesn't come off to me as that kind of player, but we don't know if he would. So if he doesn't force his way out, I would think maybe 2 more years. Then you may hear more rumblings about Karl-Anthony Towns leaving. But if Karl-Anthony Towns becomes very dissatisfied with the team, he may try to force his way out, and that would not be something that would be shocking. And there's plenty of teams who would probably love to take on a young Karl-Anthony Towns star center in this league who can do a lot. The prototypical star center in today's NBA. I definitely think we have plenty of suitors who would love his services for their current team. But next person on this list is Zach Levine. Now, Zach Levine, we've heard in trade talks for a lot of years as well. Zach Levine has played very well. In terms of his individual talent and stats, he's played well. He's developed. Remember, in Minnesota, people thought, well, he's just athletic. He's just a dunker. Because that's what he was known for. Got to Chicago, improved his game. He's been averaging 20-plus points a game for the last 2 years. He's averaging 20 points a game this year. He's averaging 20 points a game last year. 25, actually, last year. He's played very well. Now, but he's in that class of, he's a really good player, but he's not like a guy you want to make the face of your franchise. He's a really good, you would maybe say a really good third option, maybe a good second option. He'll be a free agent after this next year. He'll be a free agent. So if you're Chicago, that is clearly something you're going to be thinking about. Is Zach Levine someone who we think can build around? He has no playoff experience. They have the new GM, the new coach. Everybody's being evaluated right now, clearly, but he's 25. He's still young. He's only getting paid $19.5 million. He's a good shooter. And honestly, I just think Zach Levine would be really good at this point if he was paired up with a really good point guard. And he could be a 2. Because remember, he's a 2 by trade. So, again, more on the unlikely side, he'll be traded this year. But I'm sure you'll hear talks. If Chicago just completely just fumbles and just really is bad. Because listen, with that 10th spot, you never know. If they're 9th, 10th, they may say, okay, we're in the playoff race. First year under Billy Donovan. Team looks decent. You know what? We'll keep Levine for another year. That could be what they think. But I'm sure they're going to definitely consider potentially moving off of him. And then the last person on this list is Kevin Love. We've clearly heard about him for years. Sooner or later, they're going to have to trade him. Still has 3 more seasons left on his contract, but listen, this year he hasn't even played because of injuries. He's also he's not a great defender. And honestly, it's crazy. Kevin Love used to be averaging 25 a game, 12, 14 rebounds, a star big man, and now we look at him and think he may not even be a star player anymore. And so his value isn't clearly as great as it was probably then. And then also think about it, they just added Jared Allen, Cleveland did. They have so many big men. Andre Drummond, Jared Allen, Kevin Love, Larry Nance. They have a lot of big guys. And so you would think if you're Cleveland, you got to trade somebody. And Kevin Love would probably be the one guy. So it's just going to be difficult because of his contract. That's always been the holdup with Kevin Love. His contract is massive. He's owed $91 million over the next 3 years. That's a really hard contract to trade. So it's going to be tough for Cleveland to make that move. But it's definitely something they have to keep under consideration. And remember, we thought he was going to force his way out. Almost did. Then he said, you know what? I'm going to be better. He's played. But like I said, he hasn't been reliable because of injuries. Has a big contract. So for me, if you're Cleveland, I think you have to definitely consider moving off of Kevin Love. I feel like that's a 50-50 right now, depending on how the season turns out and depends on what maybe a team needs. They may say a guy like Kevin Love could be a key piece to what we want to do here. So it really just depends on whoever is looking into acquiring a guy like him. But that is it. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Don't forget to listen to our other amazing podcasts here at the GSMC Podcast Network. This is your host, Brice, saying have a good day, and Brice is out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.